All right, it looks like we are live streaming on YouTube. We're all set. So with that, I just want to give everyone a big thank you for joining us for our TAC meeting number 5 today. And I think we all relatively know each other and our partner agencies. And so with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Joe Dills from Angelo Planning Group.
Hi, everybody. Good to be with you again. We just wanted to check in on the minutes that were part of the packet. And I'll come back to the process in a moment. These are always just informational, but did anybody have any changes or comments? Okay, looks like we're good to go on those. Let's go back to the process slide. Just a reminder of where we are. We actually added a meeting at this point of the process, coming out of our open house and getting ready to prepare the scenario maps and so on. We felt it was better as a two-step process where we would talk about assumptions in this meeting and then move on to painting the colors on the map and running scenarios after meeting 6. So that's where we are. And we'll be returning to open house kind of outreach, as you can see in February. But that's where we are and the next steps. So let's go to first agenda item here, which is a trails update. Kira, go ahead and show the map and give us a briefing on this.
Great. So at our, I believe it was our 4th meeting, we had a committee member point out that there is a natural gas pipeline that runs through our Sherwood West area. It's a little bit hard to see on this map because we've actually made some adjustments to our trail network to sort of follow that alignment in a few places. So hopefully you can all see my cursor. The pipeline comes through this utility easement near Chicken Creek, comes down, goes through the Sherwood High School property, and then south to Kruger, makes a right on Kruger, and then goes left down this, what we're showing is this trail alignment here to Chapman Road. And based on taking another look at this, we made a couple adjustments to our trails map from what you saw in the plan concepts when those came out a few months ago. One of those is to extend this trail from Chicken Creek along the west edge of the Sherwood High School property down to Kruger. And that's kind of more or less following the pipeline alignment. And then the other change is to shift the trail from following this proposed street, this proposed north-south street here, to actually following the natural open space corridor that exists where the pipeline is. That area can't be built, so it will be open space anyway. So this trail alignment is to kind of take advantage of that open space corridor.
The easement is 60 feet wide, so it's actually going to be a fairly generous trail corridor through there, but connects all the neighborhoods and then all the destinations that Kira mentioned. So so we just want to give you an update on that. It doesn't really change the trail network too much, probably improves the quality of the southern portion of the trail a little bit. Any comments or questions about the natural gas pipeline or the trail map adjustments?
Joe, this is Joy Chang. Good question. In regards to the new alignment, are we making some assumptions then that we would have the access easements necessary to actually put a trail on top of that line?
We are, yeah.
Okay.
And we haven't checked that out with the gas company. I think it's an important bit to connect with them on. And Erica, just while I'm thinking about that, what I would add to it is, are there any, what's their total package of restrictions that they have? Including whether there's any setback recommendations adjacent to their easement. If you look at the high school buildings, they're actually very specifically set back from it, but the rules for a public building are usually a little bit different than residential.
And to clarify, the path itself would likely be built off to one side versus directly on top of the pipeline, because they will still need to be able to access it for whatever type of pipeline maintenance they need to do.
Anything else on the pipeline? Okay, so that takes care of that one. Let's move to the first of two parts of our set of assumptions for preparing scenario. Oh, I'm sorry, I overlooked the open house. So Kira, back to you on what we heard from the community.
Right, so we had an online open house available for, I believe it was a few weeks in October. We got lots of feedback, which I hear is pretty typical of the Sherwood community. They're very involved and very close readers, so we like that. That's great. Overall, we got about 50% of people who were supportive or somewhat supportive. It's these two green colors here of our vision and the goals and evaluation criteria that the committees approved at your first few meetings. This dark blue color here is sort of a neutral, people who weren't maybe quite sure whether or not they agreed. And then the light blue and the yellow here represent people who were opposed or somewhat opposed to the vision and goals and evaluation criteria. And in your packets, you have sort of the full long list of people, the long form comments that we received from people about these. And I'm going to step through the 6 plan concept topics and just touch on just real quick highlights of what we heard from those. So the first one, mixed employment areas. I'm not going to read all of these for you, but this is just kind of a summary of highlights. In the negative column, in the concerns column, people were just sort of generally concerned about industrial and office uses, and didn't seem like they were completely clear on why, as a city, Sherwood has a need for more of that. But on the positive side, people were really excited about the idea of Sherwood as a gateway to wine country, and they were supportive of the sort of wine and tourism related uses. Flex space and healthcare was another one that people seemed generally supportive of. In the great neighborhood design concept, people really liked the idea of connecting green spaces into a network and integrating nature into neighborhoods so that everyone has access to those natural parts of Sherwood they're really beautiful and make it a special place. And people were generally more supportive of adding some new single family detached homes, and less supportive of adding higher density housing types, and expressed some concerns about the impacts of high density housing on traffic and parking. And for Chicken Creek Greenway, I would say the general response was positive. People liked the idea of preserving Chicken Creek and preserving that habitat. And people were supportive of actually protecting that habitat even more so than providing access to it. So as far as natural resource preservation, that was definitely something that people were interested in. For livable and connected streets, we heard resoundingly that people support option 1. Most people in the survey, most people on our committees, that seems to be the general preferred street alignment. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that works into our assumptions for scenario planning later. And of course, the kind of general street related concerns about traffic and congestion. And our Elwert Road design concept, people liked our ideas of creating sort of a green corridor. We talked a lot about Sunset in Sherwood as a good example for how we might design a future Elwert Road, green corridor with tree canopy and buffered sidewalks, and a really comfortable street for people. And active transportation, a lot of support for multimodal connections to parts of Sherwood that are already developed neighborhoods, Sherwood High School, existing parks, parks like Stella Olson Memorial Park, trail networks, and downtown Sherwood. So making sure that we have connectivity between Sherwood West and those places that people are already going and already walking and biking to will be important. Any questions or comments on the feedback that we got from the survey?
Erica, let's throw it over to you. Any other observations or something you want to add to what we've heard?
Yeah, so I want to let everybody know that in our next city newsletter, The Archer, we are putting together kind of a long form article about Sherwood West and the planning process that we're doing, and really getting into the whys. Just like going over the comments in the survey, it just sounds as though people need to be informed of the first kind of planning process that occurred in 2015 and why we are revisiting that plan again here in 2021, and what the outcomes will be in the future.
Questions or comments around from anybody?
Hi, this is Tim from Metro. Eric, I'm really glad to hear that, because when I was reading through that, there was a lot of questions on why. That's really glad to hear you doing that. It'll help you in the long run, I'm sure.
Yeah, and this is actually perfect timing, because our Archer newsletter goes out, every 2 to 3 months, and we're hitting it on the sweet spot. So articles are due this Friday, and the Archer goes out in another 2 weeks.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. Any other comments, questions, thoughts on the survey information? All right, we will keep rolling. So now we are getting to our first set of discussion of housing type assumptions. So Erica, this is yours to introduce, and then we'll follow up with another piece of it.
So in your packet, there was a short little memo kind of relaying the key findings from the city's housing needs analysis. And we've kind of have taken that information and translated it to Sherwood West. And I'm just going to go over this information here with you. So next slide. So a little bit here on the background. So we know that the region continues to grow and the population in Sherwood continues to grow because of that fact. Our population now in Sherwood this year in 2021, we are now over the 20,000 mark, which was a feat in itself. So the city, we started to plan for Sherwood West in 2015, and we started that planning effort because we recognized that the community needs to add more land for housing. If we don't, housing prices will continue to rise and the community will feel more pressure for infill at higher densities. The housing need analysis shows us right now that the city is short 600 units over the 20-year planning period. And, we hear from the community that infill development and high density housing doesn't always necessarily align with Sherwood's character. But creating this long range vision for housing in Sherwood West allows the city to plan better and to align housing with our goals and policies. So the 20-year housing forecast is showing that Sherwood will need 1,729 units, and the metropolitan housing rule, this is a state of Oregon requirement, states that cities need to provide the opportunity for at least 50% of new residential units to be either single family, detached, or 50% multifamily. So the city's adopted housing need analysis assumes this mixed housing forecast as the following. Sherwood will be 50% single family detached and 25% single family attached and 25% multifamily. Next slide. So a little bit more about these housing types within the community. So we're looking at single family detached. The average units per acre is 7 units and with 6,200 square foot lots. Single dwelling attached, the average for that is about 20 units per net acre. And the average typical lot size is 2,200 square feet. And that allows for kind of a bigger, townhouse in size. And then of course our multi-dwelling, the average is about 24 units per acre. Next slide. So with that, we looked at our place types here in Sherwood. Those consist of our low density residential, medium density residential, and our high density residential. And the overall net density that you hear on that you see on this slide actually corresponds to our comprehensive plan designations. And so this slide is showing us the housing mix in each one of those place types. So in low density residential, we will see 95% of housing to be single family detached, 5% single attached housing. And medium density, our housing mix is single family detached at 52% and single dwelling attached at 48%. And then our high density residential, we have 56% attached housing and 44% multi-dwelling. Are there any questions about those figures and assumptions? All right, so with that, I think we can just move on.
So I'll pick it up from here. Starting with this slide, actually, the numbers on the right are basically internal assumptions to the planning model. They're not regulatory, although they reflect generally the range of uses that are allowed within each of those 3 comprehensive plan designations. So we're utilizing this housing mix as for these place types. Let's go to the next slide and talk about how we use that in scenarios. So if we go back to 2016, there were, of course, alternatives prepared for the Sherwood West preliminary concept plan. And here they are. They showed varying levels of housing, a few differences in schools, and so on. The maps, of course, have changed to reflect current kinds of priorities for the city. For example, our mixed employment areas now consume quite a bit of the area colored in yellow on these. But the point to make here is that there were alternatives or scenarios that were looked at as part of the preliminary concept plan. So what do we do for our upcoming round of scenario maps? Let's take a look at some of the inputs. First of all, there's a variety of things that influence the preparation of our scenarios from left to right. The work that was done before is always being used throughout our whole process. The middle housing rules, what we've heard from the community in one feedback loop so far, and there'll be another one. The comp plan, the plan concepts that we've been talking about over the last 3 meetings, buildable land, and the development trends. So the scenarios are really an organized way of putting all of those inputs into alternative futures for the area. Let's go to the next one. So a few of the numbers, our total planning area is 1,231 acres. If you take out the natural resource areas, if you take out the power line corridors, if you take out a percentage for roads and existing roads, and a little bit for public facilities, all of that land whittles down to about 591 net buildable acres. And that's all been documented in the buildable land inventory that's been done. And our calculations show that if you hold the mixed employment areas constant, then you net out about 198, and that gives you a net residential land supply of 345. So that's the land base that we're working with. It's kind of amazing how quickly over 1,200 acres can reduce down to a net buildable size, but this is what it does. So let's go one more slide here and talk about that assumption that I just talked about. And we'll be asking the CAC for feedback on this, but I'll pause on this slide and let's get your thoughts around the committee. One of the very practical questions is, should we hold the mixed employment areas constant in these scenarios? The 198 net acres is really what we're talking about for that area. Reminder that that's a net buildable within the purple colored areas on the map. But really the most important policy direction is we heard an awful lot of support in our market work, on this committee, at the CAC, for mixed employment as a component of the Sherwood West plan. The community, as Kira summarized, was much more mixed, so to speak, on that question, kind of taking a look at it from many folks from an impacts point of view, which is completely understandable. So, normally with a very high priority on a land use like employment uses for this area, we would lean towards holding this constant. But I want to pause here and check in, and let's get some opinions around the committee and your thoughts on the pros and cons of doing that. I need a volunteer to go first. Tim?
Thanks, Joe. I'm not not sure. I guess my question would be, is, like you said, normally you would keep it constant, and that's what I would have thought as well, given the background information and so on. But in your mind, what are the pros and cons of not keeping it constant? What are the pros and cons of adjusting it? It seems to me it would get very confusing and very complicated in some sense for people to continue to evaluate and understand it. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on that as well.
I think the pro is just more differences between the scenarios, although you can drive a lot of difference, frankly, with the housing mix assumptions. The con is we don't really have a kind of a key driver for reducing this acreage, with a couple of little exceptions. I think Area 3, just south of Kruger Road, we've had some expressions from folks that a portion of that land might be appropriate for housing. Housing next to the high school has a relationship, and when you're out there, it kind of feels that way. I'd say that's more of a footnote than a key driver. So long story short, I don't think there are strong pros for changing this constant to a variable. But we wanted to check in on all these questions with the CAC to make sure that they feel that way too. Bob, let's go up to you.
Okay. These are the numbering of these areas is not a prioritization, correct?
Correct. Yeah, they're just labels.
They're just labels. I'm not And these areas demarcation, I would have expected more for mixed use in the lower quadrant there around Chapman Road. It is of the areas where it's a lot more flat and more suitable for larger development, particularly when you're talking about commercial, retail, stuff like that.
We did try
And
to
a mixed use that requires that type of area, that flat terrain, to be able to build at all.
Yes. The western edge of Area 4 is pretty indicative of where it starts to slope uphill. There's a fairly definitive flat area. I'd call it like under about 8%. And it's very flat right next to the Highway 99. But once you get 300-400 feet deep on that parcels, on those set of parcels, then we're getting more 10-15% slope.
Okay.
And we've used one more clarification. We've used the term mixed employment, but we're not assuming like mixed use like in the same sense of like downtown mixed use. This is more light industrial, and in the case of tourism related jobs, the set of uses that would go along with that.
Okay.
Any other opinions about this? Does silence mean that you think it's probably a good idea to hold it constant? I'm seeing a head nod from Bruce. Yeah, okay. All right, well, we will. Oh,
Joe,
Ryan,
sorry,
yeah, please.
trying to get my button, it wasn't working. So holding constant is actually, that's the, I mean, that's a statistical, that's a number, right? Just by holding it constant, which I think seems reasonable, does that mean these areas are going to be the final say of where we expect to put that assumed number? I mean, are they basically, tied to each other? And I'd say to some extent, just by sheer need, if we hold constant, we are assuming that this is where it's going to need to go to hit that number.
Yes, and I think there's a little bit of flexibility on the geography, but I would characterize it a little bit as a sort of a policy position, that the policy position for Sherwood West is that it should have significant employment areas. And we've done our homework to identify where they are and about how big they ought to be. And so with that policy position, we're going to utilize the same areas as shown here on all three scenarios.
So, and you've already recognized, I think I was the one that probably stated the concern about 3, at least the north end of it around the school. There's some, possible ideas for residential land, but with just that one caveat, I think it makes sense.
Right. Okay. Okay, I will move us on unless there's any other comments on this question.
Tim has a hand up.
Oh, go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, just again, I mean, to me, it makes sense to keep it constant based on the information, that you provided before regarding the employment needs for the city and so on. Reading through the comments from the public, there was a lot of comments of like, just keep it on the east side, keep it in there as it's not. Do you have a good way to answer those questions or comments, Eric, or anything like that, or anyone on staff, to be able to address that with citizens you may get, maybe not necessarily from the CAC, but from other citizens?
No, that's a great question, Tim. And actually, I was talking to Bruce Coleman, our economic development manager, earlier this morning about that same sentiment that we heard in the community survey. And, what I gathered out of that community survey from folks is the community really I think some community members really feel that there are a lot of vacant retail and commercial spaces here in Sherwood. And that's not necessarily true. Our vacancy rate is really small. I don't know if Bruce, if you want to chime in a little bit more about.
I can do it. I think this should be looked at as sort of a different type of employment area than what you see along the Tualatin Sherwood corridor. The Tualatin Sherwood corridor is developing as it is with these larger buildings, mainly because it's within what the market sees as fairly close range to the I-5 corridor. That whole area is been developed and is being developed because of its connection to I-5 in that sense. So you'll see over there, you'll see certainly distribution over on the Tualatin Sherwood corridor. We're starting to see technology, the beginnings of technology companies recognizing that could be a good location. But they're generally the larger buildings. I think it would be very, very difficult in the market to see the Shoals Sherwood area up in the north as Area 1 is developing with that kind of distribution, because it's not anywhere near a freeway. It's away from that. I think what you'll probably see there is more campus type development over time and master plan developments that could very well include smaller companies, maybe some larger companies, but I don't see it as a distribution cluster. So I think it's a different kind of employment. I think it's companies that could be providing technology focus for the companies in Hillsborough and in Beaverton and in some areas of Tigard, for example. There is a market for that. And I think what we've basically heard from some of the consultants is, we don't really have 200 acres up there, but if you had 200 acres, it would get filled because there's very little land of that sort in this immediate area. So I think it's a different kind. And then when you look at the comment about the for lease signs, generally it's been my experience working with brokers, they leave those signs up even when there's maybe a 2,000 square foot space available or even nothing available, because they're driving business to themselves and to their firms at other locations in a lot of cases. And so where you see certain names appearing, I've seen signs that, I'm not going to use the name of a broker, but a certain broker leaves up even when the property's been sold. It still says for sale, but it's been sold 6-8 months ago. They leave those signs up because that's a way of building business in essence for them by having that presence. So I think that, I don't know if that helps at all, but it is very hard to find spaces for industrial companies in Sherwood, other than what's getting built right now on that east side area. When those buildings on the east side of Sherwood, about 240,000 square feet were completed back in, the shells were completed, I don't know, spring or winter of 2020. They're all occupied. They're all done. And that was done very quickly. It's all speculative development. And there's a real market for that. And there's going to be a real market from what everybody tells us in terms of what could happen in terms of campus and flex type buildings and those kinds of things at number one.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. That's helpful. Any last perspectives on this before we move on? Okay, let's go to the next slide if we could. Oh.
Just real quick, going back to work the city's already done and paid for, the EOA only calls for, I think, like 160 retail jobs in the next, coming decade or so. So I think that kind of counters some of those things you're hearing from people that are misconstruing as well.
Okay. Bruce, did you want to talk
I was
about
going to
that?
say one more thing. I think there is a potential kind of, I'm going to call it retail, but maybe a destination retail opportunity. Maybe that's in 3, maybe it's 4 in those areas that's directly related to the wine country. I mean, we're certainly going out there and talking to folks that can see that kind of an opportunity. And I don't think it's so much the industrial aspects of the wine country. It could be destination type projects, that could be lodging, could be a retail that's related to wine business. It could be white tablecloth dining. It could be a variety of things that could go into some planned developments in either 3 or 4. So I think that could be a different kind of retail in a sense than what people, what I generally think of as the more standard retail. It's something that relates to the fact that we are really the gateway to the wine country, but that's not happened yet in Sherwood, but I think it will happen over time.
Okay. Looking around, looks like we've covered it. We can come back if there are more questions later. Let's go to the next one. So let's talk a little bit about housing. This is all real basic to much of you, but again, we want to check in with the CAC to, at minimum, make sure they understand and get verification on the assumption that we are planning for all three general types of housing in Sherwood West. The amount of each will be variable and can be variable between the plans, but all three will be accommodated to some extent. Let's go to the next one. So Erica covered this pretty well. Part of our getting ready to prepare the maps is to define what each color on it means. And we're using the comprehensive plan definitions that she stated and are restated here. These mirror actually fairly close what was done in the preliminary concept plan. So that plan shown on the right had orange areas for its multifamily, and then it had 2 levels of residential. You can kind of see the top of the left-hand part of the slide. That's the top of the hill there, and it was called hillside residential. Lower density up there was presumed, a little higher density single family and single family attached in the other yellow. And so we'll be revisiting all of that, but basically have 3 types of residential that we're showing. Let's go on to the next slide. So within each place type, or within each color of the map, we do need to define what the overall housing mix is. And that rolls up into the housing mix for the scenario as a whole. Why do we need to do that? Why is that important? It is directly connected to directions in the city's comprehensive plan. Erica summarized those. The plan as a whole is looking for a housing mix of an opportunity for 50% in the attached housing categories of single family attached and single dwelling or multi-dwelling attached. So locally in the comp plan, state law, of course, has requirements for housing mix that are matched to income needs in the community. And then frankly, it's just an important indicator of what housing will cost and the affordability of it across the spectrum of different housing choices. So we need to turn the dials on housing mix and get those prepared. Let's go on to the next slide. Middle housing is a new part of the thinking here. As most of you may know, House Bill 2001 changes the paradigm really for middle housing to be allowed in any zone where single family detached homes are also allowed. And that goes all the way down to the individual lot level. There are a few rules about what the upper limit of that is, but it's basically quite a significant increase in the allowance for housing on individual lots. And so these scenario maps are an opportunity to evaluate, well, what if we had this combination of middle housing, or what if we had a different combination of middle housing? What would be the impacts on infrastructure, natural resources, number of school kids, on and on and on. And it's one of the advantages of doing scenarios is that you can look at those alternative futures and sort of craft your preferred future with the knowledge of the answers to the what if questions. So I'm going to keep moving through a couple of slides here and then we'll come back for discussion. Let's go to the next one. So of the things that we have identified so far as variables on the scenario maps, the amount, types, and location of housing, like I've been describing over the last couple of slides. That will be a variable. Just geographically, there's been interest in kind of relooking at where a small neighborhood commercial node would be located north of the high school. And so that we'll be looking at that. The number and locations of neighborhood parks and community parks, excuse me, a single community park serving Sherwood West is a variable. We've got a pretty good start on the neighborhood parks, but the community park, staff has told us that there is a need for that facility. It would be a fairly significant one. Erica, I'm going to rely on your memory here for the, or Kira, on the acreage. Are we talking 30 acres?
A minimum of 20.
Minimum of 20 acres for a community level park, accommodating sports needs and a variety of uses. So where should that be? That will be something that we'll explore with everybody. The location of a future elementary school. We don't have the definitive word yet from the school district that one will be sited in this area, but there was sort of a positive indication in our last discussion at the CAC. So we want to be sure to account for that. And then I think we've answered the question, at least with this committee, on the amount, location and amount of employment land. So that's what we see as being different on the scenarios. Let's go to the next slide. And of course, the inverse of that is what will be held constant. The support for the realignment of Elwert Edie will be holding that constant. Chicken Creek Greenway, a whole set of transportation improvements that are on the books now. Of course, some of them are in the planning phases, but those that have been planned and assumed to date will be assumed. The mix that allows for at least 50% of the new housing to be single family attached or multifamily, and then the parks and trails that we've been showing on these plan concepts. Okay, so one more slide and then we can stop for some feedback. So we have not gone all the way to actually painting or defining these scenarios. We've just generally defined them, and we wanted to have a discussion with you and with the CAC tonight. So the general description of scenario A, we've labeled comprehensive plan. Scenario A is guided by the 2016 preliminary concept plan. The recently, I guess it's currently in adoption, 2040 comprehensive plan update, and new city council goals related to employment and new state rules for housing mix. Those things pretty much mirror where the comprehensive plan is today, hence we've labeled it that. Scenario B would take a first look at more middle housing. So it's the comprehensive plan with a modest amount of middle housing. It would assume that some developers do take their opportunity to implement the code's allowance for middle housing in the single family zones. And on the ground, this results in more townhomes and duplexes than in scenario A. And we've got some math to do. We've got some iterations on the map to do to be able to report how many dwellings would be affected by that assumption. But if you go back to Erica's table that she showed, where overall comp plan says 50% single family detached, 25 single family attached, and 25 multifamily, what we would do is take that middle category, take the lower two categories and change them up. So we might change 25% up to 30 or 35% for single family attached and adjust the multifamily accordingly. That's scenario B. And then scenario C, we're offering up a couple of options for discussion with the CAC and with you all, where option one, both of these are what if scenarios. Option one might be some sort of very aspirational level of planning. Let's say that the mixed employment allows multifamily to be built within it, just as an idea. Or there is vertical mixed use in certain areas. We don't have market indication that that would happen, but it would be kind of a what if it did happen, what might it do to the rest of the land uses on the plan. The second option here is a further step in evaluating middle housing. It would be a study scenario that would measure what if middle housing really took off, and over the 20-year time frame, that 345 acres of residential, the market did different things than it's doing right now. And we see more duplexes and we see more townhouses being implemented. So in that choice, we would sort of have the benefit of answering that what if question from the perspective of it will be allowed in the code, what if it happens? Okay. So general descriptions, we can go back and look at any of the slides, but Julia, let's start with your comment or question.
Yeah, thanks. This is great. I'm excited about the scenario planning. Scenario C sounds a little, it's still a little unclear for me to wrap my mind around how that would work. But I guess my main comment is on option 1. I guess I'm just saying aspirational. I'm a little bit worried about saying it that way because that sounds like that's what we're aspiring to. And I don't know if that's what you mean. So maybe, I guess, can you explain option 1 a little bit more in terms of, I guess I don't know what goes into that aspirational level of planning, what that means.
Honest answer is we haven't defined it very much. And this is sort of the scenario that the committees are allowed to kind of imagine. And aspirational, you're exactly right, Julia. It does actually convey the meaning of it's something we really want to do, which is a little different from a what if scenario. So I apologize for the inconsistent terminology there. But short story, we don't have a lot of definition around option 1.
Yeah. I guess what I'm concerned about is that you're going to hear from folks that the aspiration isn't necessarily for any more middle housing than what is going to be found in scenario A and B. And so I think we need to define how that differs from those two. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that's why option 2 is there. That one is clear, and we need to explain it clearly. But scenario B is what we would phrase it here as a modest amount of additional middle housing. And we have to pick what that number is. But this is a implementation of townhouses and duplexes that in character, in numbers and so on, the zones that allow single family still pretty much are dominated by and look like single family. But in scenario C2, that is a different outcome. That is many developers, many lots have developed for middle housing because the code allows it. And it explores the implications of that in terms of numbers of homes and impacts.
And Joe, I'll just add in modeling what that looks like, what the result is a different housing mix. So that table with the numbers we looked at earlier for our residential place types, in the modeling, the purposes of modeling, we would be shifting the housing mix so that we would be getting more duplexes, more of that single family attached housing type, which also has effects on the overall density. But
Tim, go ahead.
Thanks. I just want to make sure I'm understanding correctly. So the scenario A is basically the breakout you had of 50, 25, 25.
Right.
Okay. And then scenario B would be, it's still 50 single family, but it might be 35, 15, or whatever, something.
Right.
Like that. Okay. Okay. I want to make sure I understood that correctly. Couple things. One, I think for the scenario C, I think looking at the option 2 would be interesting to see what happens. I'm not whether the market's there or not, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But you also pointed out in option 1 that kind of idea of the multifamily or the mixed, I think it was mixed areas, deployment commercial. You hadn't seen any indication that would happen there either.
Mm-hmm.
I just think from the middle housing experiment that everyone's going through, it might be interesting to see what plays out with that, because everyone's kind of looking at that and trying to determine how this is going to work on the ground. So from a scenario standpoint, I like looking at that one. My other question, in HB 2001, if I'm reading and remembering correctly, and if this is a master plan community, your infrastructure has to be planned for 20 units, dwelling units per net acre. So how is that figured into these scenarios? Or, I mean, obviously there'd be a lot less dwelling units under probably scenario A and B.
Mm-hmm. It is not assumed here because we've had a round of coordination with DLCD where they confirmed that provision within the statute is not mandatory.
Right.
It's a voluntary thing. Sherwood still might want to go in that direction. And that's sort of the spirit behind option 2. Because if the code allows for more housing, you want to know what it's going to do for water, sewer, storm, and other infrastructure and transportation as well. But it doesn't have to be 20 units an acre.
I know, just to follow up that, because I was listening in on that conversation and I'm still a little confused how they figure that out as being a voluntary and then in meeting the requirements in the rule, but that's for them to determine and not me. But
right.
I never, I was not as clear coming out of that as they explained it, I guess.
Yeah, it is not a straight line of logic at all.
No.
Erica, something to add to this?
Yeah, I'm just going to add that DLCD recognizes that fact, and they're going back to the rulemaking process to actually kind of define the infrastructure strategy in House Bill 2001. So there's more to come on that.
Yeah, I would say I think you're probably maybe in a better position than some of the other cities because they're doing their comp plan stuff right now. Just thinking of Beaverton or Hillsborough or Wilsonville, King City. Whereas they might not have as clear direction from the state as you probably would at that point in time. So.
Julia, I want to come back to your comment if I could. And I totally respect what you said. And I want to see if we can figure out then what would be the correct sort of tweaking of this and way to bring an option 1 forward to the CAC. And it might be just as simple as removal, so to speak, of the word aspirational, that we just wanted to create an option here that would allow for new ideas.
Yeah, I guess I'm still struggling with how that differs from 2 and how that differs from scenario B. I guess what level of middle housing is provided in C1 that's different than 2? Does that make sense?
Well, I'll compare B to C2. So in B, like I said, fairly modest increase in middle housing. Let's say we take that 25% category, 25% of the housing mix that's in A, that's single family attached, and we just ramp it up to 30%.
Mm-hmm.
Your code will allow 2 times or even 4 times as many housing units to be built on those same lots. So in C2, we would make those choices. We would say, well, what if we went 2x on that amount of single family attached, just as a what if?
So basically C1 is somewhere between B and C2. Is that kind of what you're thinking, or like?
That would certainly clarify it. Yeah.
Okay. So C2 is essentially almost the maximum that someone could do. Am I understanding that correctly?
Again, we have to pick the number.
Yeah.
It's a choice.
Yeah.
But we could define option 1 as 50% of what the max is, and option 2 as the max.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so sorry, I'm sort of wordsmithing things on the fly, but yeah, so I still struggle with the wording of C1 where it says an aspirational level of planning and implementation, because that's going to be in the eye of the beholder. So I think that if we can define what it is that we're trying to get at, which is that somewhere in between, it's a little bit, it's not as high as C2, but it's higher than B, so figuring out how to say that in better words than what I just said. But I think if saying it the way it's currently said is going to make a lot of people question what that means.
Okay. Because
some may feel like it's less than what's in scenario A,
Right.
So I think we need to define that a little bit more.
Okay. We'll work on that a little bit. Hopefully that then we could tweak some of the words here just in writing on a slide and see if that'll be helpful to the CAC.
Boy, you ask and your folks do it.
Yep.
It's right before our eyes.
Brian, thoughts on this?
Yeah, I agree with Tim. I mean, I really want to see what option 2 kind of if it's taken to its logical conclusion with the House bill. I'm definitely interested in that. I think just from what I see from our developers and builders side, that B is a much more pragmatic and likely scenario. If you're looking at C option 2, I don't believe we have the builders that build that style of housing, the number of them you would need, assuming across the metro region, right? Not just Sherwood, but that do that. And there's not in this conversation, there's been other conversations I've been in, there's been a misunderstanding that thinking that single family builders just can convert over and start doing duplex to triplexes. There's, people have their specialties and that doesn't just happen like that. So I'm really interested in C2. However, I think scenario B is probably more, at least in the short term, more likely within the market dynamics.
Okay. Bruce, please.
So am I understanding option 1 to be saying that you could be then including mixed use residential in an employment zone, like in a tech park or whatever it would be? Is that partially what it's saying, or is it saying that there are certain areas that you may want to have a mix of retail or food on the ground floor and residential above? I wasn't quite sure how to read that part.
It could be either idea, Bruce.
Okay. Is that a little bit like what Tigard is talking about? And I don't know if it's the triangle area where they're looking at their industrial areas and adding residential in the industrial areas themselves. I don't know if I fully understand that.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what, I mean, I've seen a lot of the development going up in the triangle. You know, and they've got office and high density residential across the street from each other.
Okay, I'm just curious. Thanks.
I think the edit here that Kira made to strike the first part of this, that fundamentally we're looking at greater variety of middle and multifamily choices. And that may include mixed use in the employment and commercial. And Julia, your notion that this is clearer if it's a continuum from B to option 1, B to C1 to C2.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Yep.
think that makes it much clearer.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else on the topics we've been talking about here? Housing mix, implementation of middle housing, defining these scenarios. Not seeing any hands up. Okay. Erica, that's all we have for this agenda item. Let's,
We have one more, just the next steps for
yeah, next steps.
scenarios.
So we'll, after the CAC direction tonight, we will prepare scenario maps and some clearer narratives and bring that back to another round of discussion in December. And then after that, we'll evaluate them using the goals and criteria that were developed earlier in the project. That'll start us working towards a preferred scenario. We'll actually have our meeting following December as a reporting out of what we've learned and where we think it's pointed towards a preferred scenario. Any questions on next steps? Tim?
Thanks, Joe. Not necessarily a question on next steps, just with the middle housing, and I think you referenced it before that townhomes are probably maybe a more logical pick out of the middle housing variety allowed by the bill and so on. Has there been, is there any other studies that have been happened, or has the state looked at anything in terms of what they think might be coming out of middle housing in these types of areas in greenfield developments? Maybe the home builders have a sense of what is there, because I know this project, but also a couple of the other ones, the townhomes always seem to keep rising to the top, so to speak.
Right. So I can share what I know, and Ryan, I'd invite you to add in too, but at the state level, there was a analysis done by Echo Northwest for the state as part of the middle housing rule development. And it concluded a couple of things. One, that the fact that you can own the ground, it's fee simple ownership, is a driver in today's economy, and it's going to be make it much more likely that townhomes rather than plexes will be built. And now under additional SB 458, I think it is, you can create those lot lines in zero lot line kind of places. So there's that. The stakeholder feedback in the Cooper Mountain project, we heard the same thing from the development community there. And then in Wilsonville, we did a little study that was trying to answer the question, how much redevelopment potential was likely in the Old Town part of Wilsonville. And the feedback there by folks that reviewed that work also went to townhomes as the housing form. Brian, anything you would add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty spot on. I mean, one of the things, at least from our side, or from the builders, is we kind of don't know, right? Those are some very, very strong assumptions, but these haven't been a big item for us, for our industry to be building, for multiple reasons. Now that they can, and there's more opportunity, I think you're going to see that, but a little bit it's an unknown. We know we're looking at other places that have duplexes and triplexes, which feasibly, as long as they're not stacked, if they're all one story, or I mean, if they all have, they don't have separate ownership above them, they can be divided by SB 458 too. So it's not just strictly townhomes where that land ownership is where the ownership possibility exists with 458. So that's a big one. I think one of the things I have heard from some of our builders is putting 2 units. Let's, for example, just a simple example, 2 units on a lot. If SDCs and everything stays the same, it's not feasible to do that, because your materials and everything is going to be the same, negligible. The difference in what you can charge on the market for those 2 units rather than one, if all the fees and SDCs and everything are included as individual doors, it doesn't make sense to develop the 2 units. And so that is definitely a concern. I mean, it's a stronger concern I have in Portland, in central Portland. It's come up multiple times with my developers, but I think it's good to let everybody here on the call know that concern with our developers. Yeah, I think that was the biggest issue. At the price points that are high, they're high enough now, and if people are looking at a townhome property, type of ownership opportunity, or a triplex, with actual ownership opportunities, you've got to figure out where that price point is, and a lot of people aren't willing to pay that a pretty high price point for those units. They would like, fully separate, detached for a certain price point. And so, yeah, like unless some of those costs, those added costs, are dealt with in some capacity, it makes more sense a lot of times just to do a single family unit on that lot, rather than try to take the risk of 3 units. So I'm hoping to be proven wrong on that, because we need the units, but that's just the preemptory concern right now.
Bruce?
I have a quick question. It's based on an area that I haven't actually been to in Wilsonville that I see some people commenting on, and I think it's the area, sort of a master plan area south of the river, or maybe I think that's south. And I wondered if there's pros. I'm going to go look at it because architects have told me I should look at it. But are there pros or cons to some of those comments that we got about liking that area south? I guess the south side of Wilsonville. Does anybody know where that area I'm talking about?
So I think the comment that I read from the community member was referencing Villebois, which is a new master plan community, single master plan developer, very high level of design, very successful in terms of its housing sales. It's almost built out. So that's the place to go visit. It's very walkable. Has a school in it. The commercial has been slow to develop, but it's definitely worth a visit.
I didn't know if that was an example of middle housing or not. It's a question asked out of ignorance. So.
Oh.
Yeah, actually, Bruce, or for everybody, I can kind of speak that a little bit. That's actually my assistant director, Roseanne's area, so she knows it better than me. But yeah, I mean, I think at least from our industry, our viewpoint here in this office, we consider Villebois a pretty big success. It is truly mixed housing of all housing types, without prior to, regulatory requirements or certainty. They have everything in there, as well as obviously commercial, mixed use, and retail, bottom floor retail. They're looking right now to put some more retail in. They're running into a little bit of pushback in the area, not specifically in Villebois, but actually some people surrounding the neighborhoods. But yeah, that is an amazing mixed use. If you want to have all income types as well as all product types, it's a great thing. Of course, it was decades in the making, and it's still not finished yet. So
Right.
as one master plan and one developer, right? So I think that's where the nuance comes in, but we think it's something that'd be wonderful to emulate if it's possible to move towards that, to really get a mixed use.
Thanks.
Any other comments or questions on any of these topics? Erica, anything from you? I think with that, that's what we have for today.
Nope, except that we'll see you all again on December 15th.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Erica, can you stay on for just a minute? And Kira
For
too,
sure.
and we'll do a little planning for this evening.